This topic, admittedly, is not as sexy as the one you had yesterday, Brexit, but I take a particular pleasure in the fact that here at Cal, that used to be the academic home of the late Hans Kelsen. So there's this connection. I think it's a remarkable one. I'm not a legal scholar, admittedly. I'm a political scientist, as you heard, but I will look at some of the pieces and nuggets of work, very important ones, from the work of Hans Kelsen that should have traveled and informed major political science concepts. I'm going to show you how it relates and how it actually antecedents major concepts. Here specifically the concept of consociationalism, consociational democracy, certain power-sharing devices implemented in various democratic polities in the past, stretching into the present, in Europe, but also beyond. So there's this link, there is this, it should have been a heritage, yeah? We should have learned from that. That's dating back in the work of Kelsen essentially to the 1920s. And the prominent concept I'm referring to, consociationalism, that dates back to the late 1960s, so 40, 50 years on. I think that's a remarkable link that got discovered by, I learned only recently, not only by myself of course, but just a very few scholars. And I'm going to show you what that exactly means. Yeah? So it's not that the political science, comparative politics scholars in developing that concept, they built upon his work, but they could have. So what is to come? First, a few remarks on Kelsen's work where it applies to forms of power sharing, the institutional design of polities, and his expectation or what kind of needs he identified for the long-term stability of any democratic political system. And then I try to make the link to the actual comparative politics concept that gained so much prominence and that actually we could also observe time and time again how it works in practice. So this is not a theoretical thing. Yeah? There was first the empirics, the practice, and then afterwards colleagues, political scientists, they poured it into a viable political science concept. How the practice actually looked like in the Austrian polity, the Second Republic, that dates back to 1945. We're still in the Second Republic. And the latest developments, whether the politics and the rather adversarial style implemented by the right-wing government of center conservatives, the People's Party, under the leadership of the youngest chancellor, that's the Austrian term, also in Germany, prime minister in the world, I believe. He had assumed office at age, I have to calculate it, to the math and the arithmetics, 32, I believe. 32, yeah. So he got recently voted out of office, but he's in the pole position again to reassume the office of Chancellor in the Republic of Austria following a snap election that is just a couple of weeks away from us. The precise exact date escaped me. We already figured out a couple of minutes ago. But it's going to happen in September, and he is the front runner again. His minor, just a quick word on his minor coalition partner, that was a fully fledged right-wing populist party with extreme or radical elements as part of its party operation. And then the final question and wrap up, do democracies across Europe or across the world, do they become more similar over time? Did they become more similar over time? There's their convergence in their actual practice. Did they become more consociational? Is there more power sharing? Or do they rather resort to the old ideal or the ideal type of Westminster democracy, or the winner takes it all? So majoritarian, conflict-based, competitive politics? Is that a trend in any of the two directions? And if so, is Austria part of such convergence? And does it drive So this actual democratic practice in the 21st century, does it drive away, does it distance itself from Kelsenian premises for how to set up a political system, the institutional side to it, and what are the expectations towards the behavior, the attitude among political elites to the public and amongst each others. Yeah, that's the book that was already, there was a reference made to it. It's fresh off the press, and I was told that, well, it would have arrived here in a couple of days from now. It's a bit of an unfortunate non-coincidence. It's a book co-edited by, I co-edited together with my senior partner Günther Bischoff, based in the University of New Orleans. And the idea was to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the, I shall say, initial democratization of Austria. During the interwar period, democracy collapsed. That's why, following the end of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy in 1918 and the founding of Austria's first republic in 1919 technically, we had the need for another one in 1945. That's why we are living in Austria in the Second Republic. So again, Kelsen's work that is informing my lecture here, at least in part, dates back to exactly these founding and forming years of Austria democratizing for the first time, 1918, 1920, in a nutshell. At that time, the views held by Kelsen, it's a combination of two things, yeah? Being an advocate for democracy itself and advocating power-sharing arrangements. That made him, in Central Europe, not only in Austria, not only in his discipline, yeah, in academia at that time, in the world, in the world of political ideologies at that time, it left him almost with a standalone position. Among the political actors, there was widespread, not only skepticism, but contempt for democracy, contempt for the ordinary work and operation of, well, what we know as parliamentarianism. On the side of Austro-Marxists, that's the major political camps dominating the scenery in Austria at that time, and for many, many decades and generations, yeah, for different reasons, yeah. But Christian socials and conservatives, yeah, they also had very deep objections to not only parliamentary rule, but democracy in more general, and of course, and most clearly, among the representatives of the third, the so-called German or all German or greater German political camp. So contempt for democracy coming from different sources, but if we subtract that from the, well, from society and political competition, there's virtually nothing left. So these three camps monopolized political support in Austria at the time. Kelsen advocated precisely the opposite: democracy, parliamentary rule, and power-sharing arrangements. The power-sharing arrangements themselves, sorry for a typo, also met much criticism, or they rather tended to get overlooked in academia because there was a bias favoring the Anglo-Saxon practice of democracy. Yeah? Westminster style, conflict-based, intense, fierce competition, but all based on majoritarian rules and practice. The winner takes all or almost all of the cake. Now Kelsen, he is pointing out to the needs of something else. It's all non-majoritarian, referring essentially to two seminal works. The Pure Theory of Law, in German, published in 1934, and much before that, I already referred to it, On the Essence and Value of Democracy from 1920. So what is in there in his writing? In favor of proportional electoral formulas. He says to guarantee democratic stability and fairness, that's in Latin a conditio sine qua non. Yeah? Any sort of democracy cannot live without it. Not anyway, given that for different reasons in any legal system, any democratic polity, there's quite a few people actually not eligible to vote. Passive and active voting rights. Yeah? They're stripped off them. There's usually good reasons for it, but there cannot be perfect representation, given that not everyone is eligible to vote. Yeah? So it's, in other terms, it's fictional anyway. He also promotes party-state features, because for him, parties are the ideal vehicle to well, to have a moderating influence on each other. They are needed to engage in discussions that would end up in political compromise. For him, that's the primary collective actors. And the sole, or not the sole, but one of the primary targets would be, goals would be to ensure minority protection. So minority not seen as something stable and definite. There's a different, actually part of the consociational, the concept of consociationalism is a rather static view of minorities, of bound and identified by, well, ethnical background or language or denomination. For Kelsen, minority means something else. It's fluid, it's changing in nature all the time. It's, in the widest possible sense, political. But agency for him requires party democracy and maybe even a party state. Yeah? And of course, one of his centerpieces, centralized constitutional review in a separate constitutional court. So a setup obviously contrasting or very different from constitutional review exerted in countries that have the common law. So that alone would not be sufficient. Yeah, there has to be interaction, and that's also something parallel to the concept of consociational democracy or consensus democracy in a wider sense, that the institutional side and the behavior, the political culture, that has to interact. And the famous quote is that politicians, parties, collective actors, they have to seek for compromise on what he calls the center ground. So again, I'm not a legal scholar, yeah? It's difficult for me to understand how it fits his pure theory of law, but here you have all the main ingredients for consociational democracy, for far-reaching, fully fledged non-majoritarian democracy and bargaining, and it's all in here 40, 50 years before the concept is actually formulated in comparative politics and political science itself. I think that's quite a remarkable course of events. So the functions to be performed are, of course, social integration, building trust, and ultimately ensuring, that's not from me, but from one of the few other scholars, political scientists and in other disciplines, that realized that intellectual connection between the two. Essentially, it triggers the survival of both majority and minority. Yeah? So one cannot live without the other. That's a dialectic relationship. So in the words of Kelsen, the minority is not absolutely in the wrong and is not absolutely without rights. So in a nutshell, that's the DNA of democracy. So now the political science concept of consociationalism. there were a couple of theories that all emerged in the basically in the 1940s, 1950s, that interacted in challenging the conventional view of the superiority of Anglo-Saxon democracy in terms of guaranteeing competition, individual rights, participation, stability, and even extending into various output-related performance indicators. One would be rational choice theory. Rational choice theory indicated that for political actors there would be good rational reasons to engage in power sharing and not leave it with the winner takes it all. A couple of them. Some would actually come with democratically speaking welcomed effects, while others, but I get into a little more detail about that in a couple of minutes from now, would be rather something lowering the quality of democratic rule and performance. But all in all, there is a lot of performance-related superiority, not just equality, when it comes to the practice in consociational and power-sharing democracies. So, of course, moderation is also a topic in Anglo-Saxon democracies. And Downes, in his famous economic theory of democracy, he stipulated in a very convincing intellectual endeavor, but also in a highly stylized version. He said, well, look into the practice of politics, policy making in the UK, for instance. Sure, Anglo-Saxon, intense competition, but in order to get elected and get through with your program, you have to take the middle ground, because the distribution of political preferences in society is actually Gaussian bell-shaped. You might have already seen such a distribution of political preferences in the electorate. You have voters amassed with their political preferences in the ideological center. So in order to get elected under the conditions of single member districts, where the relative majority is sufficient to take the seat, you have to converge with your proposals or your credible claims to the ideological center. So there's moderation. But that distribution we do not find in a number, perhaps even the majority of countries, where it rather looks something like this, going up and down. Maybe some of the voters are amassed in something that comes close to the ideological center, but you might also have an empty ideological center. And if on such a society you impose rules of the majority takes it all, the thing will just blow up in the mid or long run, because it comes with centrifugal tendencies. That's actually a term borrowed from Arend Leipert, one of the founding fathers of consociational theory. So nevertheless, in these other societies where the distribution of electoral preferences does not look like the bell-shaped one, we found frozen party systems, stable party systems, even stable democracy. So how come? Because their setup was a power-sharing arrangement. It was not Anglo-Saxon democracy or Westminster-style democracy. So that's the impetus that came from cleavage theory, to question the bell-shaped distribution and prompt scholars to ask why, in the absence of it, there is stability in the operation of democracy. And then finally, social choice theory. Is it really that easy to claim, like Boris Johnson, that the majority prevails over the minority, and that's an exact representation of the popular will? So 50% plus one vote. And social choice theory informed a different view, that the outcome of any kind of election heavily depends on the rule of aggregation, with all sorts of voting paradoxa. A over B, B over alternative C, C over A. Well, what would be the best way to decide the one thing to go for in a vote, as the outcome of a vote? Yeah. So you have all kinds of paradoxes here, and a very tight link of the actual outcome of an election on the rule applied. And that made one of the greatest thinkers in political science, William Riker, conclude that the outcomes of voting are, he's very humble, or maybe, we even don't know that, or maybe inaccurate or meaningless amalgamations. What the people want cannot be known. Hence the need for moderation, hence the need for political parties, hence the need for, well, parliamentary rule, not exclusively, but not one that can be easily overridden by direct democratic means. Again, very close to the vision of democracy in the work of Hans Kelsen. So consociational democracy comes with 4 pillars. Yeah? So with all these assumptions and premises, how should the system be set up to work? First, de facto institutionalized grand and oversized coalitions, so the opposite of minimum or minimal winning coalitions. Yeah? You don't search for the smallest winning coalition, but you seek for partners that all represent important segments, pillars in society. One might be actually the majority, and the others would be all minorities, all form respectively minorities in society, but they team up, and they do so in a very comprehensive way. All appointments according to proportionality. So you would actually have sometimes a long lineup of deputies in ministries, Secretary of States, in wherever representation, political representation through appointees might also take place. There are mutual veto rights granted to all the participating partners. Here, of course, political parties or camps. They represent camps in society and also politically speaking. Yeah? Not on every single policy, of course, but on the designated ones, the delicate ones. There is a veto right granted to every single partner. In Austria, because the party system in my country is, for historical reasons, was not a fragmented one. So among consociational democracies, Austria has always been, in that respect, an outlier, because we have few cleavages and they were not cross-cutting. So I refer to the 3 political camps of the 1920s that had so much contempt for democracy and parliamentary rule. Well, that translated into politics in the Second Republic. The German national camp that shrank in size. Yeah, that was one of the fallout for them from National Socialist rule. And but the 2 others, they still dominated the scene at 45 to 50% vote share. So we have not a fragmented but concentrated party system, which meant that a grand coalition, well, that was a coalition government composed of 2 parties. In other countries, such as the Netherlands, or Belgium, or Switzerland, it's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 parties forming such an oversized government at the same time, even in Finland. But in that respect, Austria was different, and you do not try to educate the other. You don't even always try to get rid of the cleavages, yeah? Get rid of sharp distinctions into what it constitutes a majority in society and what is a minority. But you rather try to leave it there. So some political systems, consensus democracies, they even cement cleavages in society. Others, like in Austria, we rather manage to get rid of them. Yeah? Some of these old cleavages, they are not there anymore. Topics rooted in these cleavages, like socioeconomic conflict, or rural-urban conflicts, or center-periphery conflicts, that lost salience in Austrian politics because of, well, everything that was done here. over many, many electoral cycles, over generations, biological generations. 50, 60, 70 years by now. But segmental autonomy is an option, so we don't interfere in how these political parties and auxiliary political vehicles, how they operate their shares or segments in society. So that means segmental autonomy. Now from theory and pillars and the concept to some empirics. So why the switch in Austria? Well, switch is not the right word. So the Second Republic of Austria, as a consociational democracy, completely contrasted politics and democracy and developments in the First Republic, the interwar period between 1920 until 1933-34, with the first collapse of democracy, of an authoritarian, right-wing, fascist, homemade Austrian fascist regime, and the subsequent, starting from 1938, of course, March, the being part of a totalitarian regime, Nazi Germany. So consociational democracy, if you just look at the two periods in Austria, First and Second Republic, complete opposite, because in the First Republic, politics in Austria was adversarial. Political camps took antagonist stances towards each other, and it ended up with the collapse of democracy after a couple of years. So you find a collective, I would insist that there was a collective historical learning process. Political elites that had been fighting, bitterly fighting each other, that in part both contributed to the collapse of democracy, ended up, many of them, not all, ended up a couple of years later in prison and in concentration camps. That's a pretty, don't want to make that overly simple, the story behind it is a bit more complex. But in a nutshell, that's a pretty good reason actually to try to do it better. Try the opposite. That's the more romantic aspect to it. There is also a more rational one, that of course with the danger of Austria 1945 is one of the losers of World War II, just like in the same situation like Germany itself. We had Allied forces in Austria occupying the country, and of course with developments in Germany at that time there was the risk that Austria would be divided as well, with the eastern part of the country becoming part of the Soviet hemisphere and the rest joining, well, NATO and everything that happened, from being a capitalist society and being part of the Western Bloc. So in negotiating, regaining our full Austrian national sovereignty, it simply helped to be united internally. That's a rational choice approach, even at the price of, well, standing together, bless you, behind the fiction of Austria, the Austria of 1938, having been the first victim to Nazi Germanic aggression. That's of course outrageous, but to some extent, whether we like it or not, it worked. And Austria, after 10 years of occupation, regained full national sovereignty at the price, if you wish so, it did not turn out to be a price, nor a curse, of, well, declaring the country's, and that's a quote now from the bill, eternal neutrality. So de facto, of course, becoming a member of the Western Bloc, economically, politically, but when it comes to defense systems, formally we stay out of trouble. Very convenient and something perfectly compatible with other elements of consociational democracy. Yeah, and finally, political elites discovered that that might actually be something pretty comfortable for them to share power. Well, at first glance, it's counterintuitive that you would have a majority, like the conservatives in 1945, even an absolute seat majority in parliament, and still forming a government of, in 1945 actually, of all the three parties represented in parliament, yeah? Including the much smaller Communist Party. Yeah? But that was a concession to, you know, the Soviet occupation force. But even after that, yeah, there was one grand coalition after the next, where the two partners actually met, in terms of their electoral support, completely at eye level. But imagine how much there was at stake, given that you have two major political camps, supported each by 45 to 50% vote share. It's a frozen society, a frozen party system, just a few party switches. But of course, at a lower scale, there is societal change. So the numbers are changing, not too much, but they can. But if they change, they do so not on an everyday base, or not thanks to campaign events or short-term fluctuation or a charismatic politician, but for structural reasons. So there was a lot at stake, because both camps had to fear that they would actually, within a couple of years, switch from a structural majority, a very thin layered one, but a structural majority, to falling into the category of a structural minority, and vice versa. And that means stress for political parties and politicians. They don't like that, yeah? So there was, what they did is, by engaging in grand coalition and other means of consociational democracy and power sharing, they were curbing political competition. They amputated political competition. Whether a party gained 1-2% or lost 1-3%, whether the largest party in parliament became the second one, and the second became the largest one, in terms of, well, government composition and government policies and the legislative output, there was no difference to it. Frozen, stable, curbed political competition. So how did they do that in Austria? I'm partly repeating myself, because it's a textbook case in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s for consociational power sharing. You have the grand coalition. You have a de facto grand coalition, even in the absence of a grand coalition formed in parliament, where simply grand coalition style policy making moves out of the parliamentary sphere and is taken care of by, is it already there? As part of neo-corporatism, with privileged by law accommodation represented with who is at the table, that's centralized bargaining schemes, employer side, employees, and they just meet there and do all the bargaining that in other countries is done in parliament itself, but the function it has is the very same. So it's a fallback position. Yeah? It got activated in 1966, when that was the first time that there was no grand coalition formed, and it extends with absolute majorities enjoyed by this then Socialist Party of Austria well into the 1980s, but the underlying mechanism is still one that is characterized by de facto grand coalition government, by neo-corporatist policy consultation, and which together combined into a fully fledged continental type welfare state. You have heavy taxation in that system, but you have limited redistributive effects thanks to the insurance principle that's better known as the Germanic type of a welfare state. And that's a perfect example for meeting on center ground. Yeah? That you have high taxation, you have means You have means-based or needs-based social entitlements. But the end of the story is that in terms of vertical redistribution, there's not too much going on. So you meet on center ground again. Party state features heavily developed. In the early 1970s, 1 out of 3 voters is a member of a political party. 1 out of 3, with 1, 2, 3, 3 1/4. Of course, facilitated by patronage and political clientelism, housing, jobs, etc. And that, of course, was facilitated by having key industries nationalized right in the aftermath of World War II. So that's actually, if you think it through, it's a pretty coherent setup of everything. Yeah? And it is largely compatible with, well, the vision I referred to that comes from Hans Kelsen. There are some objections to be made to it. Yeah? There's not perfect compatibility between socialist rule and practice and the Kelsenian vision of democracy. One would be that, I just referred to it, that well, parliamentary rule is curtailed because of political scientists. We would call it external partisan veto players, like corporatist or neo-corporatist actors. The Austrian version of it is called social partnership. Yeah? So there's legislation prepared and discussed and bargained over that some of the people involved, they might be members of parliament at the same time. But the decision-making process is not taken care in parliamentary committees. It's not about committee work. Austria has a somewhat inflated body of constitutional law. So why is this the case? So grand coalitions in Austria typically enjoyed a constitutional amendment majority, a 2/3 majority in parliament. And they heavily used it, for better and worse, to make their lives more comfortable, which took the nature, the shape of what in other countries would be an ordinary law. They, given their 2/3 majority, often it was even a 9/10 majority, enjoyed by socialists or social democrats on the center left and left of the political spectrum, and opposite to them the centrist Christian Democrats or conservatives. They elevated, with their supermajority, they elevated ordinary law into constitutional law. It entered and inflated and made, to some extent, in some policy areas, it actually made Austrian constitutional law a bit incoherent. That's, by the way, also something that occasionally happens in other European countries where government would actually enjoy such a supermajority. In a country I'm particularly familiar with, it's called these contents are called cardinal laws, and there you have essentially a menu, a recipe for gridlock and deadlock, because should the current government, which enjoys such a majority, go lose of its majority, and there would be a new incoming government that would not enjoy the same supermajority, their ties would be their hands would be absolutely tied, yeah? Because these laws, that's part of the constitutional body, yeah? It even prescribes, it names all sorts of tax rates. Yeah? So a new government not enjoying that supermajority, they couldn't do anything. There would be no leverage, no steering policy when it comes to socioeconomics, balancing the budget, strengthening the economic competitiveness of the country, etc., etc. Yeah? So here you have the Austrian example of that, and it's one which is not always problematic, but it's on Austrian specifics. Representation of minorities, which supposedly should be a strength of consociational democracy, yeah? And something that Kelsen fiercely advocated. But in reality, consociational rule is based on a very orthodox notion of what constitutes a political minority. It's formed along the cleavages in society. I named some of the cleavages that apply. Yeah? Capital and labor, of course, most prominently. Religion, denomination. Are you religious? Are you holding secular views? Or are you anti-clergy? Do you live in the capital city of Austria, in Vienna, or in some of the peripheral rural areas? That's all covered. Yeah? That's effectively channeled into the political process, into accommodation, into bargaining, into finding center ground. Yeah? That's very well represented. Other minorities that do not conform that are not rooted in these cleavages, they're having a rough time. That's of course smaller scale minorities. Yeah? But it would be of course equally important to see them represented. And one category would be, for instance, ethnic minorities. Yeah? Croats, also some Hungarians in the Austrian province of Burgenland, for instance, or the Slovene minority in the very southern and southeastern part of Austria, Carinthia, and a few of them also in Styria. And the promises made by the Austrian Grand Coalition towards the Allied occupational forces in the mid-1950s to protect their rights, these promises repeatedly got violated up to the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s. Yeah. So it's very discriminatory. Yeah. I'm ready to criticize my country here. Yeah. So that you have privileged minorities, and then you have minorities of other sort, ethnic ones, for instance, where representation clearly did not work. Another one would be all sorts of atypical categories of employment. One example here would be unskilled laborers in the agriculture. That's actually a problem up to this very day, and it's one that hurts the economic interest and protection of labor workers from Central Eastern, rather Eastern European countries. One of the other rather unwelcome side effects should have been there, are party-state corollaries such as clientelism. I already referred to patronage. Of course, a party-state is often comes with interference in business, and that's also the case in Austria. The relationship between clientelism on the vertical axis and, let's say, the degree of economic development on the horizontal axis, that's curvilinear, which means that the more affluent, the more highly economically developed the country is, the less clientelism we are supposed to find. I won't go into the theory, that's not the main body of my talk today. But given that formula, Austria is a notorious case. It still exhibits, well into the 2000s, we're actually here, notorious levels of clientelism and patronage. That's a rather unwelcome heritage of power-sharing party democracy. So Kelsen said that, well, in terms of stability, minority representation and the dialectic relationship between minorities and majorities, that's a conditio sine qua non for the survival of a democratic polity, at least in the long run. Yeah? So how do these consociational democracies, how do they fare? How do they perform when it comes to, well, in this empirical study here, the satisfaction of people with the actual operation of democracy, their trust in democratic core institutions, given consociational rules. And actually the findings nicely confirm the Kelsenian expectation, or the view also conveyed by supporters of consociationalism, that first of all, consociation rule or counter-majoritarian institutions, they help actually to reduce the gap between losers and winners. In such countries, when it comes to socioeconomics and other important pieces of legislation, the winners are less clearly winners and the losers are less clearly losers compared with Anglo-Saxon democracies. So the gap is somewhat shrinking. Yeah? And the consequence it has in terms of satisfaction with democracy is that those who typically end up on the winner's side, they are not getting frustrated about being less of a winner. So they show equal satisfaction with winners, the more pronounced winners, in Anglo-Saxon Westminster-style democracies. So here you don't have a trade-off. Yeah? Things are not getting worse. But you find a significant change to the better with the satisfaction, the trust in democracy among those who typically end up on the loser's side. And from there comes a surplus of satisfaction with democracy. And finally tested against a whole bunch of questions, performance indicators, consociational democracies and power-sharing democracies, they rather actually tend to outperform the majoritarian ones. When it comes to, well, for instance, fighting the inflation rate and fighting unemployment at the same time. Yeah? I'm not an economist, but I read that in many economic theories supposedly there's a trade-off between the two. The consensus democracies, they perform doing both jointly, they actually clearly outperform majoritarian democracies. And there's a whole bunch of other performance indicators where at least that type is performing equally well, if not outperforming Westminster-style democracies. How did the practice in Austria actually take a look at the time? Yeah? 10 more minutes, is that fine? 10 to 15. Yeah. So consociational democracy in Austria, like in other countries, Switzerland, the Netherlands, it has been on retreat. Partly because it is a success story. Yeah? Meeting on center ground, having neo-corporatist policy consultation, having developed a continental type welfare state, all that actually made us getting rid, at least in part, of cleavages in society. And in the year 2000, there was a major, these developments actually consolidated into a new pattern of composing government. For the first time in many years, again, there was no grand coalition government. It's kind of a precursor to what happened in 2017 with our young prime minister, chancellor, that formed a pure right-wing government. There was a precursor to that in the year 2000 to 2007, when politics, the style, the rhetorics, in part also the policy making became more competitive and adversarial style. A little bit jump over that. These numbers did not really reflect in Arendt Leipert's framework. But Austria, I want to point out, in the more recent decades, showed an ability that other consociational democracies, like Switzerland, like Belgium, like the Netherlands, does not possess. We are actually in a position for pendulum swings. Pendulum is a bit of an exaggeration, but the extent of power-sharing agreements is primarily regulated by government composition. So I referred to the 4 pillars of consociational rules before. In Leipert's terms, patterns of democracy, whether there's a fusion of power, like in the UK, or there is a division of power, like in Switzerland and other consensus democracies. He operates with 10 variables. In the Austrian case, there is a hierarchical relationship, that the extent of power sharing is primarily regulated by consociationalism, which is the composition in government. So in the moment, literally, when the ideological composition of federal government, Austria is a federal state, changes from grand coalition government to something else, some of the counter-majoritarian institutions and also the extent of neo-corporatism is ready to be reduced. And that's how Austrian democracy and consociational democracy operated during the years of this right-wing government, 2000 to 2007. And then things with the Grand Coalition in 2007 actually celebrating a comeback, the time is by and large pulled back into the 1980s, 1990s. The background is, of course, why Grand Coalition government returned is, or why it actually survived a couple of coalition formation processes in countries. We talk about another 10 years period, is the international economic and financial crisis of 2008-9, with repercussions that in some countries, think about Greece, and some of the other Mediterranean countries in Europe, can still be felt today, as of today. And so in this situation of crisis, actually Austrian politics elites, in part also the public sentiment, resorted to the old tradition of consociational rule, which came with grand coalitions, revitalizing or energizing attitist traditions, deficit spending. That was part of the menu. New corporatism at a large scale reenacted. And this comeback of, well, almost a romantic relationship also the public had during these years, at least in the beginning of managing the international economic and financial crisis. That also could be seen in the performance ratings and popularity of certain key portfolio ministers. The two most popular ministers at that time, 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, were the Minister for Economics and the Minister for Social Affairs. One, of course, representing the center-right party, the other one representing the center-left party, and both deeply rooted in social partnership, in new corporatism. So long before they became ministers, long before they entered parliament, these two had been key figures in new corporatist social partnership policy consultation. And during these years, because there was demand for that, given the shape of the nature of the crisis, these two became by far the most prominent, the most popular politicians. And one was seen to be the natural candidate to be selected for the office of head of state. We directly elect the head of state in Austria. He was clearly the favorite, the Minister for Social Affairs, and the other one, his counterpart on the conservative side, well, he seemed to be in the pole position for becoming the next Chancellor of Austria. What happened is, nothing of that happened, of course. The Minister for Social Affairs at that time, he ran in the presidential election, and it was a crushing defeat for him. It was brutal. So what had happened? One crisis we left behind, the economic one, the social one, the financial one, the budgetary one. But another one had emerged, and that was the migration crisis or challenge, the influx of migrants in 2015, 2016. So public demand for leadership had changed significantly. And the other minister that did not become chancellor was the predecessor of Sebastian Kurz. And Kurz's ticket to become the party chairman and eventually the chancellor of Austria was his handling of the migration crisis. So you see, it's certain crises actually demanding certain leadership. I have to jump a little bit over this. So the Kurz government of 2017 to 19 did not end in an election. Support for this new right-wing government was very stable throughout from May 2017 till, well, actually as of today, the support enjoyed by the right-wing government was astonishingly stable. If you see the line here, that's in black, denoted in black, the black line, that's the conservatives under the leadership of Sebastian Kurz. It ended because of a corruption scandal within the Freedom Party, so the smaller coalition party, the right-wing populist extremist one. The vice chancellor and the leader of the parliamentary group of the party, they got taped talking to what supposedly was a client for corrupt practice, and they were bragging about opportunities to actually, well, sell out the Republic of Austria and key industries to Russian oligarch investors. So that ended the coalition. But in terms of public support, that was very stable, and it was a popular government. So what did they do? The change here was not so much new policy commitments away from consociational practice, but it was less policy commitment and more the rhetorics, which is rather anti-parliamentary, anti-institutional. Sebastian Kurz was the first head of his party that did not enter government as a vice chancellor. And he was the first deselected by vote of no confidence a couple of months ago. The first deselected chancellor that said, I'm not exiting politics. I'm running again as the chairman and frontrunner of my party. I want to reassume the office of chancellor. Yeah? But did not accept his seat in parliament. And this is something that relates to the Kelsenian vision, negatively relates to the Kelsenian vision of democracy, and it's something not only to be found in Austria. There's more developments, executive, competitive federalism promoted by governmental policies during the last 2 years, including attacks on Red Vienna. So at the subnational, regional level, again, Austria is a federal state. All the other, actually 8 provinces, with the help of the federal government, the right-wing government, they actually altered, in a legally disputed process, altered, for instance, social benefits package in order to actually create a pull factor for the unemployed and for asylum seekers and for freshly arrived migrants into the capital city. So that's a bit of a nasty thing to do, yeah? That you actually lower your social standards just to create, for the purpose of creating a pull factor into the one province that that has its benefits package remain unaltered. There was a further streamlined legislative process. That's not an entirely new element, but again, that's a sign that executive politics shows at least partial neglect for the sometimes cumbersome and long parliamentary process. And it's rather part of a division of labor within the coalition government. There were serious attacks on the public service broadcaster in Austria and independent critical journalists. Finally, something that they had planned but not poured into a piece of legislation was to strengthen direct democratic means. And that's also something that Kelsen clearly was not in favor of. Okay, that's where we are right now. What has happened with Western democracies? Did their practice actually become more consociational? Was there more power sharing arrangements, or was there actually is the fabric still one that we know from the UK or from the US? Well, we find at least in Europe something like limited or conditional convergence that has to do with party-state features in older Western European democracies actually disappearing, including in Austria, while in the fresher democracies of Eastern Europe, there's a bit of a consolidation, a crystallizing around political parties. There's more consolidation going on. So if you define convergence as, well, an average, an all European or all democratic mean, it means that democracies became more similar over time. There is policy diffusion and spillover effects that result from EU membership. We're becoming more similar in our democratic practice and perhaps even in our political preferences at large, because we're all part of a supranational political body. What Leipart, or what studies in the tradition of Leipart could actually reveal is that there's a hollowing out of ideal type cases. So the UK is less clearly an Anglo-Saxon Westminster style democracy compared with the past, and Switzerland on the other end of the spectrum is a less clear-cut example, a prototypical example of a power-sharing democracy. Austria conforms as an older democracy, as a consociational one. There's a lot of convergence, but there is still a consociational heritage that Kelsen very much would have liked, including social partnership and a policy consensus. Policies that are very divisive in structuring political competition in other countries, such as, well, nuclear energy, or same-sex marriage, or gay rights, or there was one more I wanted to say, which is missing. Yeah, important one. Anyway, abortion, abortion. That's not a salient topic in Austrian parliamentary elections for one reason, because none of the major political parties credibly claims that they would actually alter the status quo. They all have a position on the matter, on these matters, yeah? But they don't promise, or they're not credibly promising to alter the legislative status quo. So it's there. Some people have feelings about it, but it's not a salient political topic when it comes to informing vote choice. So that's I think, one of the last two slides. So what are the options? In the Leipart framework, there is a very consistent lineup. He actually operates with a two-dimensional map of democracy, of democratic practice. One is about the institutional aspect, and the other one refers to the cultural aspect of, well, how much power is divided, how much is it shared, and how much of a fusion of political powers vested in the executive, national government. Yeah? So that's a pretty consistent lineup. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 different quadrants, and you pin down countries with their actual practice, their polities in one of the 4. Now, in more recent decades, it seems that the picture is becoming less clear-cut, more incoherent at times, and a bit more complicated to read. Some consensus or consociational democracies, they're just locked in. Like the key case here, a rather worrying case, would be Belgium. Society changes, there's globalization, potentially new cleavage is emerging, but they're not moving. Yeah? The political culture is not changing. Yeah? You have the ever same political parties represented. You have the very same political institutions. There's no attempt, or there were no successful reforms to actually adapt the old institutions to, well, an ever-changing world. And that means segmentation, immobilism, and a major problem every time when it comes to finding a majority in parliament. A couple of years ago, the time it took from election day to inaugurating a new government in Belgium, I think it was 200-something days. That's not operable in the long run. Occasionally there's an attempt to combine something like the best of two worlds. Yeah? Westminster style, majoritarian, have clear-cut majorities, a clear political responsibility, and then they are getting re-elected or being voted out of office, but also, well, satisfy demand for perhaps a more personalized electoral formula, but keep proportional representation. And one of the models here that strives is actually the German model of a mixed member proportional electoral formula, where you have a vote, a proportional vote, a list vote, closed list vote, but you have it's actually the first vote is in a single member district, but the proportional effect is the prevailing one. Yeah, maybe we're seeing, and Austria would be one of the example, functional, or perhaps that's a hypothesis, dysfunctional hybrids between the two. So the Austrian solution, workable solution so far, was that you shift. You have periods of consociational patterns of governing, and then at times when there's demand for it, you have grand coalitions, you have the fallback option to share power. Yeah. It doesn't work simultaneously, but if one comes after the other, and government composition would not change, that pattern would not change in every single election, but let's say in a 10 to 15 years period, it's actually a system of, a nicely working system of adaptation, and one that also helped the country to handle the economic and financial crisis of 2008, 9 and the following years pretty nicely and in a smart way. Another example would be actually the political system of the European Union, with opt-out clauses, with a Europe of different speed, a core Europe, the idea of a core Europe, and with the introduction of a new element with the Lisbon Treaty a couple of years ago, qualified majority voting on selected policies in the European Council. That sometimes works, but there are also to put one element, to fusion the elements, where actually the hard political decisions are taken, but it does not always work. It did not work with the relocation of refugees across Europe. There was a qualified majority vote in favor of it, but simply some of the defecting or opposing governments in Eastern Europe, they still oppose it. Yeah? So the entire system of relocation, even though it was voted on with a qualified majority, it never got implemented. It didn't work. Or even worse, are we heading towards kind of fusion that leaves us with meaningless amalgamation at government's will? Maybe this is the dynamics we see happening in the United Kingdom right now. I mean, I'm not British, yeah, but I recently penned an op-ed. 2 more minutes, is that fine?
1.5.
Oh, 1.5, okay. I penned an op-ed in an Austrian daily national newspaper, and for me it became apparent that what is happening with the recent dynamics in Westminster right now, that actually it removes more from the Westminster system of government and democracy than credibly did the devolution process under Tony Blair in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and perhaps even membership in the European Union, because it's just astonishing and outraging what is possible right now in, well, having parliamentary sovereignty swept away in Britain right now, or whenever it pleases the executive or the prime minister. So, sum up, there is not everything here is bad, not everything runs against consociationalism, not everything runs contrary to the Kelsenian vision of democracy, but there's a number of toxic relationships, yeah? That you plot or you pit, for instance, the will of the people and popular demand against the role played by key institutions of representative democracy, specifically parliament. And even someone who does not have a clear record of shifting away from consociational democracy, like Sebastian Kurz. Yeah? There's not a red thread that says he is completely against it. But what he does is that he engages in that sort of rhetorics. And it comes with a great deal of anti-elitism. Even sometimes when it comes to other topics like not socioeconomics, but how we fight climate change. What is our role in it? Sometimes selectively praising scientists, while others or communities of scientists, well, meeting with contempt is too much, but undermining their authority. And that's a permanent process. And finally, as it turns out, in Austria, but also other polities, trends of personalization, public demand for having the political process set up in a more personalized fashion. So it's pretty much the opposite of party-state democracy. That creates leverage for the core executives. Again, at the expense, for instance, at parliamentary rule. Thank you.